Very good morning to everyone. Thank you to the organizers and also thank you to Ayush. You made my job a lot easier because I'll be starting from where you have ended. So to set the tone for my presentation and also place my presentation in a certain context, social media and democracy, and most of the studies exploring the relationship between the two, have largely focused on how social media has been used to develop collective actions, which Steenberg and Bennett and Steenberg have called connective action, the logic of connective action. Arab Spring, Occupy Wall Street movement, At Home, India Against Corruption, and Nirbhaya movement are all examples of how social media has been used to penetrate the democratic participation that has been imagined via social media. However, post 2015, that is the mid of 2010s, we also see that right-wing forces have started to appropriate the very domain of social media and have used social media, in fact, to propagate and proliferate their own message and extremist ideology that otherwise wouldn't have been possible in a usual offline liberal framework. So this is where I begin with my presentation, which is titled Digital Hindutva, the Symbolic Construction of Majoritarian Identity on Social Media by the Indian Right. To begin with, the structure of my presentation is as follows. I begin by asking three broad questions, and then I make three propositions that are based on those questions. I present my central argument, and then I discuss social media and the Hindu right to offer my own model of digital Hindutva. The second part of my presentation is focused on the case study, which is to explore the Hindutva alt-right in India and how the memification of Hindutva has happened. That cannot be done without taking into account an event that happened, which is Sully Deals and Bully by Rose. I'm not sure how many of you are aware of it, but I hope after the presentation you are. And then I move on to the discussion and finally conclude my presentation. Okay. So the very first question, and of course as the title of the panel itself suggests, is on relationship between technology and democracy, but also to ask how social media impacts democratic imagination, renegotiates democratic spaces, but also subverts those very structures. And these questions cannot be asked without understanding the notion of political participation and autonomy. The second question is a lot more narrower and focused on technopolitics in India, which looks at how technology has been used by the right-wing forces to pursue their own political goals, looking at the interplay of technology and political agency. I also look at social media as a site of construction of political subjectivity and identity and the performance of those very symbolic identity. I also look at social media as a site for propaganda, which blurs the lines between state and society, though that is not the focus of my presentation here, but in future I do aim to look at this relationship. The third question is what situates my paper with the global literature on far-right communication, which is that how social media has emerged as a common denominator in the surge of global right-wing movements across the globe. Moving on to the three propositions that I make, social media, it has been a tool for radicalization. And I look at this by looking at the very architecture or the very making of social media in itself, which Dana Boyd and Kakavan talk about as affordances of social media. There are many affordances, 6 affordances that are there, which includes connectivity, shareability, persistence, replicability, and also identifiability. We can take that up while discussions. But what I also conceptualize is that social media acts as an echo chamber where individuals often subscribe to their views and ideologies that they hold true, and therefore they will be more exposed to those similar kinds of ideology, thereby strengthening their prejudices. Carl Sansin calls this cyber polarization, which is strengthening of their own prejudices. I also look at the second side of social media and radicalization, which is that of techno-populism that Ayush has already mentioned, but I look at the demand side of populism, which is to say that when audience begins to speak in the language of the populace themselves. Because majority of the work that has happened on social media and Hindutva or Hindu nationalism has focused on how Prime Minister Modi, or there's been a rebranding of Narendra Modi, an excellent paper by Jarjit Pal that looks at how the populace has used social media, but my paper focuses on the demand side of it. The second proposition that I'm making is of technopolitics of Hindutva 2.0, which is to ask that if the Hindu right has really changed, and there have been many studies that have confirmed that Hindutva has necessarily changed in its strategies and the way it moves, and therefore I fundamentally argue that through the use of social media, Hindutva has altered the very terrain
of Indian politics, mainstreaming the ideology that has been facilitated and expedited by a compulsive and creatively destructive use of social media. The third proposition is that social media as a site of identity construction allows the Hindu right wing to construct a symbolic majoritarian Hindu identity, and in the performance of these identities and subjectivities, there's also a normalization of violence that goes on, which impacts communal sense making in the everyday. The central argument, therefore, is that social media has become Hindu right wing's main tool to create and generate symbolic scripts that is representative of their narrative in producing and popularizing those narratives, thereby manufacturing a majoritarian consensus to both legitimize and normalize violence. And in the exercise of this identity, the Hindu majority comes to understand itself as a Hindu through the violence that it carries out on the minority. This is the framework that I'm going to begin with, which is that of digital Hindutva. So to understand symbolic Hindu majoritarian identity, you can understand it as a flip side, side A and side B. The side A of the majoritarian identity focuses on generation of a Hindu solidarity or a collective sense belonging that it offers, but also on the flip side, there's a dramatized and ritualized vilification of the Muslim other that generates and strengthens prejudices. I use the concept of normalization of violence given by Irm Halim, and she talks about that repeated acts of violence are no longer viewed as immoral but as necessary and ordinary. And she gives three axes of how normalization of violence takes place: that of moralizing, popularizing, and also legalizing violence. I focus on the first two, and the third one is not on the purview of my paper. Moralizing violence comes when violence is framed as divine and necessary, and popularizing happens when it is carried out in the name of the people, and therefore creating a majoritarian consensus. Now, another framework that I borrow from her, which is extremely important, is that we have all heard about WhatsApp lynchings that happen when social media results in lynchings itself, but it is not necessary every time that violence on social media necessarily translates into the offline and the physical realm. And therefore, to account for the violence on the side of digital media itself is extremely important, which is why I borrow the concept of metaphysical violence, which talks about the intangible and non-physical form of violence that happens through language and iconography. The next slide begins with the two sides of this one. I don't have time, so I think I'm just going to skip this. And I move on to introducing the frame of digital Hindutva. I've already mentioned this. I'm going to go to the working model that is there. So I have identified 4 ways in which Hindutva right-wing mobilization is trying to capture the space of social media, which is that of manipulation of history, misinformation and disinformation, memes, music and other art forms, which are 4 M's. I will be focusing on the third M, which is that of memes, and therefore coming on to the memification of Hindutva. I take up the case study of Sully Deals and Bully Bhai app, in which in the month of July in 2021, almost 100 Muslim women found themselves and their profiles uploaded on the internet, where certain Hindu right-wing men claiming to be traditionalists and not belonging to any political party though, were conducting fake auctions. And these Muslim women were prominent authors, prominent journalists, and also the mother of a missing student, as we know, Najib. We also have Bully Bhai app, which was created in 2021 of December. So while Sully Deals app was not, the creators of Sully Deal app were not arrested or found. Of Bully Bhai apps, they were arrested but also granted bail, citing that they were first-time offenders and therefore should be released. This wasn't the first attempt of conducting fake auctions of Muslim women. These are the cover pictures of the app. In fact, selling Muslim women as deals of the day also happened over Twitter by a handle called @SullyDeals101, which Hasiba Amin has noted, who was herself a victim. On 13th May 2021, a YouTube channel called Liberal Doji with 87,000 subscribers ran an Eid special that hosted a live virtual auction of Muslim women, rating women, their body shaming them and bidding them for 5 or 10 rupees. Describing sexual acts and issuing rape threats. Again, I don't have time to look at the audience responses, but of course, if the discussion comes up, I can. Moving on to how the right-wing groups presented Sully Deals and Bully Bhai apps as just a prank and a harmless joke. And these are the memes that are that I found while conducting a digital ethnography for almost 3 months. I'm so sorry, the images are pretty wild and explicit. Now, moving on to the discussion of Sully deals and bully by apps. The memification of Hindutva should not be seen as an isolated event. It's not something that has just propped up suddenly, but rather something that has grown over for the past decade with the constant trolling and state-sponsored trolling, in fact, of activists, journalists, and authors and who have been prominent critics of the government. This trolling has allowed the audiences to also consider it as okay and doable in a democracy, thereby curbing dissent. This result of state-sponsored trolling then also problematizes the relationship between Hindutva alt-right groups and state, and thereby moving on to the way alt-right groups in the American counterpart. Now, here I am trying to link Hindutva alt-right group with the larger far-right groups. In the American context, alt-right groups existed before populist resurgence of Trump. But in India, however, alt-right groups have specifically grown in the past 5 years or so, which is after populism. And therefore, we see that there's a direct link between populism, techno-populism, as well as the growth of Hindutva alt-right. The second point that I come to is that the Indian alt-right or the Hindutva alt-right is exclusively online phenomena, similar to how alt-right groups have been in the American and the European counterpart. The constitution of the Hindutva alt-right is that most of the members of these groups are upper caste men aged between 18 to 25, and they do not claim to overtly belong to any political party or right-wing outfit, but actively believe in Hindutva ideology. Similar to the alt-right groups in the West, they are active supporters of the government and the right-wing party at the political helm. It also brings us to the fault lines in Hindutva that have emerged over the past decade, that though the Indian alt-right does seem to have similarities with extreme right-wing groups, there are certain differences. So the Hindutva alt-right is divided into two groups, which is that of traditionalists and the raitas. Raitas being the actual sour dish. But traditionalists and raitas both together aim for a Hindu Rashtra. But the routes that they take are extremely different. And Alishan Jaffrey and Naomi Barton's work was extremely useful in this regard. The traditionalists espouse for misogyny, caste-based violence, and also openly call for genocide against minorities as the only viable method for making India into a Hindu nation. The Raitas, on the other hand, who are seen as soft Hindutvas by the traditionalists, see that legislative and policy making are the only two avenues to make India a Hindu nation. Benjamin Mock also notes that a section of the alt-right group, I'll finish it, thank you, also mentions that traditionalists do not favor the right-wing populist leader Narendra Modi. In fact, they believe that he is too soft on Muslims and therefore also have referred to him as Maulana Modi. Coming to trolling, most of the women on Sully deals and bully by apps who were trolled were largely Muslim women who were active critics of the government, and therefore Martha Nussbaum also notes that online misogyny is deeply connected to shame punishment as an attempt to bring down women and have power over them. I move on to the next part of the discussion, which is how Pepe, as some of you might know, Pepe is a neo-Nazi figure and in Germany, used in Germany, but he's gotten Hindutvaized, has also gotten a Savarkar makeover, and is also at the site of Babri Masjid demolition. So Pepe, being Hindutvaized here, also talks about how memes are malleable symbols and have certain textual flexibility that Rob Jenkins has called a spreadable media. The alt-right is also using, this was by the way, a Nazi propaganda poster that was completely reconfigured and was posted by Swati Singh, who was one of the accused in the bully by apps case. We also come to the languages, the online codes and languages that Hindutva alt-right has developed. They have used K2O, K2UA, Chuslims, Sully and Bully, all which are extremely derogatory terms used for Muslims. And lastly, the point on weaponizing humor and irony. I think this cannot be highlighted a lot more emphatically, that by using humor and irony, not only are the right-wing groups today, like in the contemporary moment, disarticulating themselves with a very aggressive understanding of, in American context, white nationalism, as Hartzell would argue, or in Indian context with Hindutva, as I would like to put forward, that by disarticulating whiteness, or in this context, a majoritarian identity of Hindus, they try to present the majority community as the disadvantaged and the victims, and thereby using jokes to deflect any criticism and expand the scope of what is acceptable and not acceptable in a liberal democracy. The right presents a critique of liberal values, secularism, that have in the past supposedly burdened the Hindu majority to tolerate the minorities and others despite being in such large numbers. These activists not only derive pleasure but also attach a larger sense of purpose by sacralizing and moralizing their duties as civilizational Hindu warriors. Like most of the profile pictures that I found while collecting data was that of a masculine Shiva as the profile picture of these documents, or a angry Hanuman. All of these were the profile pictures of them. So to finally conclude my presentation, we are the largest democracy and we pride ourselves on that. We also have the largest Muslim minority. Such radicalization on an everyday basis, and everyday communalism, as Amogdhar notes, is extremely dangerous to proceed further with our democracy in India. But also the fact that social media has been able to draw these connections and transnationalizations and draw convergences between right-wing extremist movements, not only in the West, but also in the so-called global South through India. And finally, the theoretical model that I've offered of digital Hindutva attempts to build on a lot of literature that has been there previously on right-wing social media, but to look at how exactly is the process that's going on. So thank you so much. Yeah.